Hey everyone, it's Dez and Marco with After School with the Admins. Thank you for tuning in. Please like and subscribe, share with a friend. Here's our newest episode.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of After School with the Admins. I'm your host, Marco Torillo, and I'm here with my co-host,
Des Caldwell, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
We have a special guest with us today. Joining us from Oregon is Joe Truss. Joe, how are we doing today?
Doing all right. I got a little walk-in. My endorphins are up, so I'm feeling good.
Fantastic. Joe works with Truss Leadership, and he is a member of an area that works on social justice and racial equity coaching. What I'd love for you to do, Joe, if you can, is tell us a little bit about yourself and also tell us about your journey through this to this place where you are today.
Yeah. So first, thanks for reaching out and giving me a little bit of space to talk with you all, and just creating the platform for educators to hear from other educators, to not feel so isolated and overwhelmed. So I know how much work that involves, and I know how hard the work is. A little bit about me, primarily of all the titles I have, the title right now is father of 3 little kids who keep me very, very busy. So I don't know where that goes on my resume, but it's at the top with all duties assigned and unassigned and to be determined. When I'm not doing that, I'm a racial equity coach and consultant, and that's everything from trainings, strategic work, leadership coaching, doing a Wednesday afternoon PD in a library at a school, pulling together principals, doing professional development for them, working with a leadership team, anything, running cohorts of BIPOC educators to work on empowerment, a little bit of everything. How I got here, I've been doing this for the last 7 years, I guess now. Wow. And before that, I was a middle school principal for 6 years in San Francisco in the big public district there. Before that, I was an assistant principal at a high school. Before that, I was a middle school dean. Then before that, I was a high school Spanish teacher. And before that, I was in college and whatever, traveling the world and whatnot. What brings me to the work is, when I was in undergrad, I thought I wanted to be a doctor, 100%. And I was like, took the MCAT practice, pre-med programs, internships, doing autopsies in hospitals. I was doing that. OChem, you name it. But as I learned more about my history, as I learned more about, global politics, global history, as I learned more about sociology, I understood why I was in the predicament I was in specifically. So before college, I was a first gen kid living in the 80s, living in a red light district neighborhood in San Francisco, single parent home, living in the 80s in the crack cocaine epidemic of time period, and everything that comes with gangs. I never did those things, but everything around me was gangs and drugs and alcohol and you name it, all the things that kids shouldn't be experiencing. But that was the backdrop of me being in school. So that gave me my experience. But when I got to college, I understood more of what was going on. I understood how this was by design. I understood how this wasn't just San Francisco. This was many cities across the nation. And there was a legacy behind all of that. I start with the pre-med story was because I wanted to do medicine to help somebody with some things, right? I love science, but as I understood the problem better, I knew that being a doctor wasn't really getting to the root of what was going on, or it wasn't going to impact the number of people that should be impacted and supported to better navigate this broken and oppressive system. That led me to education, because I was like, well, how can we get closer and sooner to people who need help, right? And for me, I love teaching and education. So I fell into that. I was a Spanish major that led me to being a Spanish teacher. And then, later on I became an administrator and all that, but it was always trying to support folks that are kind of forgotten about. Like I grew up in a neighborhood that in my mind, we were forgotten about, right? We were counted out. And even though I made it through, quote unquote, that process, everybody else I grew up with did not make it through. And those people were even more forgotten about than I was. So, I felt like I had a duty, a responsibility to do something. And it was less about saving children than this kind of white savior, middle class savior complex. It was around empowerment and liberation and healing and justice. Before I knew all those words meant, I knew that I wasn't just going there to colonize some more children. Do you know what I mean? Everything else I learned over time and read books or whatever, but I went into the work with that in mind. And that's the same reason I wanted to be a leader, to do that at a larger scale.
Thank you. So I have a few different questions, just with your intro, and I appreciate that. First, I want to just clarify for those who are listening a few terms that you use that may not be familiar to them. The first, you use the term BIPOC. Will you tell our listeners what BIPOC means and why you chose to use that term instead of terms that they may be more familiar with?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably a more well-known term now. And there's some others that I use also. So that stands for Black, Indigenous, and other peoples of color. Sometimes people call that people of color in general. Why does the BIPOC stick for me? Because I think even as we talk about people of color, especially being on the West Coast, I've seen Black people, sometimes Latino people, but even more so Indigenous people, get erased and forgotten about. Even when we say that we are serving, quote unquote, people of color or marginalized people, somehow you still can't find Black people there, and you can't find Indigenous people in that space. That being said, a term that I like to use more so now is people of the global majority, because as we talk about being marginalized and being treated like a minority, it's important to put things in the global context, that we are not anybody's minority. We're just outnumbered in this particular place. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. The next question. You said you grew up in, I believe I heard you say red light district in San Francisco. For those of us on the East Coast who may not have been to San Francisco or only know the 49ers and, just what we've seen on TV. What does the red light district mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think, if you're familiar with San Francisco, it's more than cable cars and the Full House show. You know what I mean? That's the same to say, you can be in Washington, D.C. and it's more than the Capitol there, right? It's more than the downtown Manhattan part of New York or whatever, right? So there are the bad places and the less desirable places everywhere. There's an east of everywhere, right? There's a St. Louis and the East St. Louis. There's a Oakland and the East Oakland, right? Red light district kind of comes from this terminology of a place where things that are illegal are allowed to happen, right? And the law enforcement tend to look the other way. Oftentimes that's used with kind of sexual work or whatever, but it also applies to drugs as well, right? I think for people on the East Coast, if you've seen the show The Wire, and this point in the series where they talk about the place Amsterdam, like, is that right? It's the Skid Row, right? It's the place where there's rules in most places, but there's some places where there are no rules, and yet there's people living there and children living there, and they're supposed to be going to school and all of that. So it was called the Tenderloin, and it still is that way 40 years later.
Thank you.
Yep.
And then there was, you sort of skimmed over, you said that you'd worked in schools, you were an admin and all that. can you give us a little bit more of the time you spent working inside of the schools, not as a consultant?
Yeah, I mean, so I think, the longest time I spent anywhere, and probably the work I'm most proud of, just because I spent time there, and I, knew a little bit more about some things at that point in my life, was spending 6 years as a middle school principal. The school is called Visitation Valley Middle School. It's a regular public school in the big district of San Francisco Unified, but it's also in one of those forgotten parts of the city, right? So, the San Francisco got a lot of parts of the town and lots of schools, and they're schools of choice. You know what I mean? Like, mine was a school where people called up when I first got there, and the parents were like, "What? My kid's not going to that damn school." Like, I'm like, "Okay, ma'am, we got to do something about this." So, it served kids in public housing, kids in poverty, and the like. So for me, it was close to home, just because, like, I knew that, right? I mean, I wasn't still living in public housing at 25 or 28 or 30, whatever it was, but I understood what that meant, and I understood what schools historically do to people who come from those communities. So I've only ever worked with those kind of schools. I was happy to be there. Hard work, but I could be anywhere. I could be making billions of dollars doing something, but what's the point of that if I'm not progressing anything or supporting folks who are marginalized, right? We're some skilled, talented, intellectual people in schools, right? We just do this work that people don't necessarily value at the same rate that they value these other professions. But you talk to these other people doing these other jobs, and we know where we're at. So I'll leave it there.
All right, I appreciate it, Marco. I see you chomping at the bit, so I'm gonna turn over the microphone to you.
First of all, I love that statement. I love that statement about just knowing that you could make more money. We all get it. Like, as educators, we know there are a lot of jobs out there that make more, have less stress, have less worries, even if you want to put it. They have different worries, but not as much as what we do. And I think it's that calling we always talk about, that we have to do this, that we do this because we know we want to help others. And I love the fact of the way that you put it. And like when listening about the choice schools, and we all have our personal feelings on that one. I'm going to leave that one alone. In another episode, we do talk a bit about that, about our conflict with some of the choice systems versus public systems. But I will say the fact of, like, I like the fact that you were like, we got to change this. Like, it shouldn't be a situation that all of a sudden, because you're not going to some school they think is going to be great because it's the choice school, like, you should want to have that pride in that public school, that pride in that area. And it should be something that shouldn't be the forgotten areas. And I listen to that and I hear that, I'm like, absolutely. I agree 110% when I hear that part. But what I want to hear from you is just a question of that I have listened to you say all that is, what made you want to make the jump then from that person that's right now, that made the choice? I don't want to be in medicine. I don't want to work as a doctor anymore. I want to be a teacher. I want to help kids. I want to go through that. I want to do this part, to then making the choice that this wasn't enough. And I'm not saying that, and I guess is my words of it, not yours. Like, this small area that I'm helping and I'm building, because it's a big world to everyone around there. But right now I know almost like I do more. Like, what made you make that change to go, I need to do more than just this. I need to make sure I can touch more than just this.
And are you asking about being a teacher to a leader, or being a school leader to being a consultant? Which one?
Leader to the consultant, to make that choice, to make that jump, to say, I need to do this so I can help others.
Yeah, I mean, it was really organic. I'll be honest with you, right? I thought back when I was being a principal that I might write a book someday about leadership. Right, that was kind of the impetus for some of this work way back. So I read Zaretta Hammond's first book. Happened to do some work with her, and she was a colleague or a mentor. And I was a leader at the time, and I'm thinking about school leadership while she has written about and is supporting folks with how to do teaching and learning. So I'm thinking, what does leadership look like? Obviously, but how do I start to explain what I'm learning as I am a leader, trying some things out? What am I thinking about the things that I'm reading, and what am I learning about the things that I'm trying? So that led me to blogging, right? Back when there was blogs and people read blogs, right? That was a medium. That was one of my favorites, right? So like at a certain point, like, man, I was just writing a blog post a week, like, And sometimes it was based on a book I was reading. Sometimes it was based on a meeting that I had at school. And I try to be really vulnerable with like what the experience was like, and thinking out loud of the dilemmas that leaders struggle with as we're thinking about transforming systems and transforming culture. I thought the blogging was going to lead to writing a book originally at some point. I didn't necessarily think I was going to be a consultant for like 15, 20 years or something like that is what I thought, right? And writing blogs. People, I started getting, I'm putting it out there. I'm getting a good reception. And then at some point I started doing some workshops on some of the stuff that I was learning and trying out in my school. People were inviting me to come do that in my district, outside of my district, in another state. And then I started seeing people's response to the conversations I was proposing and inviting them to be a part of in some of these workshops. And I realized how little there was out on some of the stuff that I'm interested in talking about. And because for transformation, there's just not a lot of support and tools and practical shit around how we lead and coach in different ways. A lot of stuff about teaching and learning, some good, some not good, okay? But around anything beyond the teacher work, just not a lot. So when I saw the reception to that, I was like, oh man, like I got some more ideas here, right? And I'm seeing people's hunger and appetite for this work and this conversation and need. So then that led to me doing like some day-long workshops, and I saw a good response for that. And then, for me, I've never been shy about talking about racial equity. I don't care what it was called before. Diversity, cultural competence, dominant ideology, whatever. For me, I was always having the same, trying to do the same work. So now when the pandemic hits, all of a sudden there's a lot of interest in this. And I didn't necessarily pop up all of a sudden like, hey, I got some ideas. Like in the middle of the pandemic, I had some stuff that was already rolling. So I went from, no lie, this may sound like an exaggeration, but the people who know me know, I went from doing in-person workshops with like 30, 35 people there. So we get into June of 2020, and I had a Zoom for 2 days long for like 14 hours with like 950 people.
Wow.
Okay. Across the country, globally. And, we were locked in for 14 hours of learning. Wow. And collaboration and planning. And because I just took what I was doing in person and put it online. I didn't necessarily know. I'm learning Zoom just like you guys are learning Zoom in that time. I just happened to fashion that into some online learning, right? Once I get to that level, I'm like, oh my God, now I'm connected with these 1,000 people and the 500 people who couldn't even fit into Zoom because Zoom has a limit of 1,000 people. Little did I know in that moment. So now I'm like, man, there's more out there. And now I see how much interest there is. Mind you, this is the political reckoning kind of time, but still the people who are diehard invested in this work, they also emerge during this time too. So now people are like, well, what do I do now? What do I do next? So then all of a sudden I'm working with school districts and I'm working with schools and I'm coaching people. And I launched a couple courses on leadership and teams and teaching. And it's just a snowball, right? Like it just takes over. And I was like, this is what I got to do because I love this work. Also, like, I love being a school leader, but one of the things I loved most was professional development, coaching, vision, strategic planning. That's the part I love. There's a lot of other parts and other people love other parts, but now I got to do that with my work, right? So like, that's what I do now, right? And now I have no limitations as to what I can create. I can make my own frameworks. I can make my own rubrics. I can make my own learning sequences, and I do. So once I got to that freedom, right? Like there was kind of no turning around. You know what I mean? And I was so busy that like I was working 2-3 jobs in one because there was that much work to do.
Yeah. So I absolutely remember having conversations with my staff, right? And at that point, right before the pandemic, we were still like just starting to roll out what it meant to be anti-racist versus non-racist, right? We were just starting to roll out what it meant to be what white privilege meant. We were just starting to talk about what bias was and looking at the brain and how having bias is not inherently a terrible thing. And people were just not ready for it, right? Like I remember someone standing up and saying, well, what about reverse racism? And being like, oh gosh, like we're still there. And I commend the work you did and the work so many people did during the pandemic online. Because as someone who was in schools as a principal at the time, I remember that people had so much time during the pandemic and they were genuinely interested, and they were in a place where they could just like be still and learn.
Yeah.
And so many educators came out with the science behind how the brain works and why they were making decisions that they were making, and how their upbringing impacted and media impacted different thoughts and ideas they were having. And to hear people come back and communicate with me after, and just flat out say, you know what, I apologize, I did not give your professional learning the proper chance. You were telling me these things, and I was not in a place where I could hear it. I was in a place where I felt attacked. And whether my PD style is an attacking style, or receiving that information felt like an attack, or a combination of the two, people were able to hear it in a way that they were not able to hear it in person, sitting in a room with their anywhere from say 50 to 100 colleagues, and
Right.
receive that. And so I absolutely commend you and all educators who were able to do that during the pandemic, because I definitely didn't understand Zoom well enough to try to pull something like that off, outside of the having a staff meeting, which was quite miserable during the pandemic. I want to shift a little bit with a question. So whenever we mention equity, DEI, anti-racist coaching and consultants, we always have the naysayers or non-believers, those who are just ignorant to the field of study, or just flat out, white supremacists, who think that this is just sort of liberal speak, right? This is just what these liberals were brainwashed to say, and we reject it. So when you're brought in to coach or consult, I know one of the things you do is a needs assessment. Can you talk to us about what that needs assessment looks like? Because obviously this isn't just a box curriculum that you throw at everyone. So how do you determine who gets what?
I think one, you got to know kind of what you're offering, or from my perspective or from my angle, I got to be clear with what it is I'm trying to do, right? That at least allows, on your end, or on a school educator's side, to identify, does that sound like that's what I kind of need right now? Do you know what I mean? So when I got into the work of being an educator, I wasn't trying to do moderate work, right? Never ever in my career. I was always trying to do progressive, liberal, and sometimes radical work, because I'm coming from where I'm coming from. Like, the people at the margins, they don't need incremental shifts. I know that
Right.
from lived experience. So I'm not going to have an incremental conversation. I'm never going to, because that doesn't serve the people who need more than increments, right? That being said, that's how I operate as a consultant too, right? So you go to my website, you're going to see what you're going to see, right? Like, it doesn't say I'm trying to do diversity 101. I'm not. Because we've done that. And the people who are thinking about doing some work with me, they've done that too, some version of it. I'm not trying to do that. Like, it may sound crazy, but my first workshop was called Dismantling White Supremacy Culture in Schools. That was the first one I did in 2019, you know? So that attracts people who want to have that conversation. And that's not to say that they've done A, B, and C and they're ready for D. That also says that they want to have a deeper conversation because they've done the superficial, shallow, comfortable conversations and they've seen where that's gotten them, right? I want to work with those people, right? Because I don't want to convince the people who haven't done that like they really need deeper work when they want to do shallow work. That's not going to get me anywhere, right? Like that's a different line of work. And there are people who do that work. Cool. I actually want to know the people who tried something and they hit the wall. They want to know why they keep hitting the wall. I want to talk to them, right? So part of it's like who finds me. The second part is I'm gonna have some of that conversation in the process with them to figure out where are they at, how are they currently diagnosing their problem, because if I want to know why they're contacting me too, right? Like, what do you think the problem is? What question are you sitting with? Because that tells me where they're at with their consciousness. That tells me where they're at with their reflection. That tells me where they're at with how much data they've collected. Because if they say like, well, I just need somebody to tell me how to get these kids to follow the rules, like, okay, you know, like there's a plan for you, but that's not me, and that's not transformation, right? Now further through the needs assessment, I'm going to find out, well, what have you done before? What have you tried? What data are you sitting with that you're upset about, that you want to shift? Who you think wants to have the conversation? Who doesn't want to have the conversation? And I don't want to start with the people who don't want to have the conversation, because that's not no change initiative, no theory of action is ever going to say start with the most resistant. And any leader knows that much after some experience, at least, right? Mm-hmm. So there's some ways to scale to kind of start with like the early adopters and the interested folks, the coalition of the willing, whatever you want to call it. Sometimes that could be within a school. Sometimes that could be within a whole district, right? So I have districts where I'm just starting to work with educators of color because they're willing to talk about racial equity, and right, they know. So some of that needs assessment happens there. If I'm able to come out and visit and see some classrooms and see some schools, I've done that where we kind of walk around and do like a bright spot tour to look in the classrooms. You know, I can come out with a rubric or whatever. I can also just come out and do more of a qualitative needs assessment with focus group questions and interview questions and all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of like whatever we can pull off, right? Like anything's possible, but it depends on where everyone's head is at, and how interested they're in. My biggest needs assessment question is, how long are you interested in doing some work too, right? Because if you're interested in, you know, if you don't know the answers to that, we got a problem, right? If you think it's a short amount of period, then you don't know really what you're up against, right? And I'm not the person for you either. You know, like when they say like, well, you know, we're interested in like some long-term, maybe multi-year work. Okay, now I know we kind of got something. Same thing with school leadership, right? Like any good initiative is a multi-year initiative, right? To get there, to get somewhere, right? So I try to take those same approaches as I do my consulting too. And it's very formative, right? Like I'm always collecting data. I'm always kind of seeing where it is. And it's always touch and go because we're up against a system that was not built for change. It's not. So, you know, at some point I might get pushed out, and that's okay. Like I'd rather be pushed out advocating for radical change than pushed out asking for incremental change. And what was the point of that? Or only amounting to incremental change. So, you know, I'm a little more philosophical in my approach. But you know, the data doesn't lie that we still have problems that we need to address, you know?
I like the statements that you just made there with that last part about with the system. And it made me think of, there was a quote, and hopefully I'm going to say it right. And the quote was that when people say like the system is broken, it's not. It's working just the way it was built to do. Is a statement that gets brought up again. And I think of that when you say that part about it's working just the way that people wanted it to work. And it's our job to keep working on it and trying to keep changing it and fixing it in the way it should be. But it's not saying it's a broken system. It's made to do the bad things that it's doing.
It's doing good things for some people, right? So it's also designed for the success of those with privilege and power, right? So it is designed to do that as well. And the one thing I'll say in response to that is there's the big system of like policies and rules that we have to follow and funding sources. And those are big things out of the control. But there's also the little lowercase system where it's just like, but when you close the school door building and you've got all your people in the same room, it's us, right? Like there's no imaginary people coming in to teach these classes. It's us, right? So in a certain case, we are also implementing the design also, right? Every day, unless you got some boogeyman that's in your room teaching all the lessons and running your building. Like, no, like it's us. But we are the system too. So in that regards, once you cross that threshold of people realizing that they also have the power to change things, then you're like, oh, that's right. It's me, right? Because like any effective teacher knows when they close the door, they can get busy, regardless of the constraints, right? When they feel that empowerment and they got some skills to get there, they can do that. So you can do that in a building too. Take some work, take some development and whatnot. But people got to realize that they are the system too.
So to go with that, you said about, you first start with always the people that are willing to do the work, that are willing to take a deeper dive than going through. And, sometimes, like you said, sometimes it is the people of color that are the first ones you'll work with, or it may be some of the individuals that are willing to reflect and see and understand. Once you've gotten those staff members, how do you start that process to start getting to those ones that on the line? Because we know the last to go are the last to go. The ones that are kicking and screaming and not willing to listen and have to come up with 1,001 excuses. But the fact of the matter is there's those middle ground people that are having that internal struggle, that are fighting with themselves and being like, but I was taught this in my life and this is what it is, but this is what really is. Like, how do we start to work on those individuals?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we're talking about change management now, right? We're talking about organizational theory, right? Organizational leadership. And this is the same things that I thought of as a principal, right? Because like there were things we were trying to change when I was a principal at my school. We were trying to do more restorative practices. We were trying to do more literacy instruction. We were trying to do more deeper learning and project-based learning. Those are big shifts in our school system. And with all of them, we had the whole gamut, right, of folks who were interested, not so interested, and like vehemently opposed to the work. That existed there too, right? As far as how you do that, when I work with leaders, I mean, first of all, like that process of changing a whole place cannot happen without leadership and school site, instructional leadership team, some kind of body. Like it is not moving without those two pieces, right? Now those two pieces doing some things, but like it's not happening with just like some gung-ho teachers that are just great teachers and like they're going to transform the whole school. It's not happening. So at some point there has to be some work with those groups, and also those groups need to be doing some drastically different things, right? So when I can work with a school leader, even better, right? Because then we could talk about, well, what does it mean to lead in different ways? What does it mean to lead in an inclusive way, in a culturally responsive way, in an anti-racist way? What does it mean to do that? What are we not doing? What are we doing, right? And like I said before, there's not a lot of resources on this topic out there. And if they are, they're not practical, they're theoretical, right? So I've only been engaged in the practical part of this as a practitioner, but then now as a consultant, right? And I would love to have a book out, but just that hasn't been in my cards at this point, right? But when I get to work with people, that's what we're working on, right? How do I craft and communicate a vision that is pointing in the direction where I'm trying to move, right? How do I monitor and assess spaces and groups of people in real time so that I can kind of see what's going on with my staff during a PD or whatever's going on and maneuver and redirect the group, right? How do I design professional development? Like if you can't do these things in line with where we're trying to go outcome wise, you're not going to get there, right? So like how you turn the table on like that middle group that's like the early and late adopters is you got to have all that stuff in place. You got to have a vision. You got to have a culture that is a vulnerable professional learning culture, a reflective culture of adults, right? You have to have a long-term plan that people understand and get that they've co-created in some way. You got to have norms that are that promote a brave space instead of a defensive space, all those things, right? And they all take time to kind of build and create. But those are the foundational pieces that you could put restorative practices in there. You could put deeper learning in there, right? You could put social emotional learning. But we've learned that when we drop any of these really great ideas into a bucket of acid, it's going to get dissolved by the toxic culture. We know that, right? But a lot of people don't know how you transform that toxic culture, right? And that's what I've always been interested in, because you're not going to get the whole group until you do that work, right? So that's what I tried to do as a leader, and that's what I try to do as a consultant. It ain't easy, but if there's time and investment and interest, right, we can get there 100%.
I agree with you on the fact of that a lot of the literature out there is theory, and I think, but at the same time, I will say, I think as an educator, and this is again my opinion on this one, we sometimes get stuck in wanting just the practical and asking that answer of going like, you get teachers are gonna be like, okay, just tell me what I'm supposed to do. Just give me the answer. Like, they don't want to think about it first. They just want to be like, tell me the 5 strategies I'm supposed to use that is going to get the kids that are not paying attention to my class to pay attention to my class, not realizing that sometimes maybe it's your class is the issue. It's you who is the problem. Like, you don't see it yet. It takes time sometimes to reflect and go through that theory. You have to read your Glenn Singleton. You have to read, your Zaretta Hammond. You have to have your opportunities to do some of those first to get an understanding of it. And I'm happy that you are an individual who is moving into that practical, because I think also, though, at the same time, once you get that theory down, and I won't even say it's really down, you start to get an understanding. The problem is you sit in the thespian world, is the way I like to call it, where you are very good at the conversations, but where is it actually translating now into the classroom to be able to show performance, to be able to help the students, to be able to go to that next step? Because everyone can leave that meeting and leave that professional learning, leave that grade level meeting, having a very deep conversation, and then they go get a cup of coffee. It doesn't mean that anything changes when they hit that classroom. And that's that component. I think hearing you and saying what you're doing with that, I feel that's great that you are working on that part next.
And let me say one thing to that. The other thing that gets to getting more, I guess maybe you could call it buy-in or more implementation more so, is you can't just say, leave the meeting and go do the thing. We know that. So what do you do instead of that? You have to get people bringing back their reflections and their own observations on what they tried to do. So it's got to loop back to the next meeting and the next meeting, and the next meeting. 2, you got to get peers looking at each other for the right thing, right? Not the wrong stuff, right? Not coming together to just commiserate and complain about what's going on. But when you can get 2 teachers who are next door to each other sitting down to talk vulnerably about their practice and their mindsets, that's it, right? You don't need the leader there. You don't need the police officer there to police what they're doing. But when they're like, you know what, like, I'm really struggling with this student, and I'm wondering, like, am I approaching the student in the wrong way? Like, is my identity influencing how I'm showing up with the student, how they're reacting to me? What do you think? Like, if you can get 2 teachers doing that, you know what I mean? Like, everything else is easier to do. Now, how do you do that? It's part of the process, but like, we got to know what we're trying to build. And lastly, like, at some point we got to be in the classrooms, right? Like, administrators got to be in the classrooms, peers got to be in each other's classrooms, superintendents, they got to be in the classrooms, but they're showing up with the wrong checklist. They're showing up with the wrong check boxes, right? Because there's no alignment between the things that actually shift students' experience and the mechanisms and the structures that we have built in, right? So when I get to work with districts and tie those things in, then we can see something, right? Then we can kind of be honest with ourselves. Because once you go with the right checklist and you look, whether that's looking in the mirror, looking in the colleague's classroom, or a superintendent looking in a classroom, then you say, oh, wow, I got to be honest with myself with what I see. Now we should really shift resources, professional development, accountability structures, all the like, right? But those people who do these things, they're doing something else, is what I found.
So I know there's a mention of anti-racist classroom walkthroughs, and so you just mentioned walkthroughs.
Yeah.
What are people looking at? What is on that checklist when you go into a classroom and you are doing a walkthrough that's focused on an anti-racist classroom?
Yeah, I mean, so many things, and we know that we can't look for all of them at the same time. We know that, right? But we also have to be honest with how complex and how demanding how high that bar really is, and it should be, right? To do teaching and learning that's healing and empowering and instructive and deep, that's a high bar. It should be, okay. Two, it helps to kind of focus on some bands, just like we do in all rubrics, right? Are we talking about relationships? Are we talking about the curriculum? Are we talking about the pedagogy? Are we talking about the assessment? So what I started doing was I took those typical boxes of how we talk about teaching and learning, but I tried to take this, racist, oppressive, or liberating and anti-racist approach to that, to say, if I was to think about relationships in an oppressive way, what does that look like? If I look at it in a more collaborative, more empowering, anti-racist, anti-oppressive way, what does that look like? And I just started filling in the blanks / pulling from the books that I've read over time. So, I made my own rubrics over the last couple of years. Some of those things are, if we're just talking about teaching and learning, and Zaretta Hammond is really great at this, the students have to be holding the cognitive load, right? Mm. It is racist to hold everything for the students, and it's crippling to their intellectual development and then their future success as an adult if they're never grappling with the difficult work, okay? It's equally crippling to keep passing them by and never support anybody to get there, right? There's a happy medium in there, right? So student talk time is always on my list, right? Are the students talking? That may not sound racist or anti-racist, but if the educator is doing all the talking, the educator is doing all the learning, the educator is demonstrating all the learning and understanding, that's not really empowering to students. And if our students have to be students of color, and they're the ones that are mostly getting a teacher talking at them, or silence, or PowerPoint, or laptops and a silent in there, they're not doing the cognitive work, right? So kids talking, kids wrestling with this information, critical. Representation in the curriculum, critical, right? What stories and what primary source documents are students looking at, right? Critical, right? Does that represent the kids that are in the building? Does that represent the diversity in the nation and the world, or is that just one Eurocentric or white male-centric representation of what's going on and whoever did anything in history, right? So many things, right? What else would I say for that? I would say movement is on that. Seems simple, but we know how controlled the bodies of our young people are, especially in public schools. They're supposed to sit down all day, and they're in trouble when they move. You know what I mean? So movement is critical. Movement with purpose, sure. Movement to four corners, have some conversation, go get some resources, get outside, whatever, right? But movement is critical. Critical. Let the children move, and so on and so forth. When I do work with folks, it's a whole 2 to 4 page rubric, depending on what we're looking at. And sometimes we co-develop that, right? In some places, we generate that list of what are we looking for together with the right criteria, right? That we just don't end up with the same list every time that. Yeah.
Would you be able to walk us through the process? I know you have something that's with assessment, foundation, reflection, and action. I have a feeling that goes to that next steps after your walkthrough, or at least that's my belief going from there. Can you give us a little understanding of what that process is, and even also how you came about that process?
I think just experience is probably how I came about it. I mean, the assessment is probably the needs assessment, right? It's hitting towards that of what is that? What are we working with here, right? Whether that's big data, whether that's qualitative data, whether that's observational data. The foundational is we got to have some level setting of do we have the same understanding of what's going on? Because once we start engaging in the work, if we're not clear with the mindsets that we're bringing to the work, the mental models we're bringing to the work, it doesn't matter what work we engage in. It doesn't matter what great new idea. It doesn't matter if it's read a guy last book or this book. It doesn't matter if I drop it into that pool of acid. It doesn't matter. that pool of acid could be in our head, right? We read lots of good things over the years. Certain things stick, certain things don't stick. So the foundational part is, do we understand foundational historical, social, political context history in education? Do we understand big concepts, right? Do we understand some mindset stuff, like the culture setting for the group? Then we can talk about some kind of action and some reflection on those actions, right? The reflection, that's pretty self-explanatory, right? But it matters what criteria we're using to reflect. The rubric matters. The checklist matters, right? And then we're in this like rosy kind of cycle of inquiry kind of cycles, right? We've done those all the time, right? But what we don't often do in those cycles of inquiry are the foundational stuff, and the culture work so that what we're doing shifts what happens, right?
Do you find schools get stuck in any of those areas?
Do they get stuck in any area? I think schools are just always acting. I think that's just kind of where we're in the day-to-day, you know? Last year's data is this year's data, is next year's data, is next year's data, and we somehow do school every day, and the data is somehow the same data every single time. So I think we're just acting. Reacting probably, and acting, but like it's somehow the same show. This year, last year, 20 years ago, when I first started, when I was in school, if it looks the same, like, yeah, we're stuck. We're stuck in we're not doing enough of anything other than status quo, getting through the day, man. I don't know. I mean, this, in general, sure, there's, you know, exceptions to this, but that's what I would say.
Do you find that your measurement of success is different in each space? And do you go into it with, if someone says, you know, we plan to do this work for however long, do you say, like, in this amount of time we should see this level of change, or is it much more organic than that?
I think it's super organic because, like, as an outsider, I can't control many variables, you know? It's different when I'm the principal and I'm also doing the evaluation, and I'm also doing some of the PD, and I'm also sitting on all the leadership team meetings. That's different, right? Now, when I can work with a leader that knows that about themselves, that they sit at the nexus of all these pieces, it's different. But how can you make promises when I can't control those variables, and I can't control if you're gonna push through when it gets hard, right? That part I can't control, because, like, I'm actually trying to find the place when it gets hard. And if you know you're gonna tap out and run for the hills and bend the knee to the privileged people, you gonna blame me for that? Like, you can't blame me. I can empower you to kind of get there, what to say in that moment, and build skill for that. But if you know that you don't want the smoke, then you don't want the smoke. You know, like, I can't, you know what I mean? Like, this work that we're trying to do is big work, right? We've had these technical attempts at changing these very complex and adaptive problems, and it ain't worked. We know that for decades.
Do you find, and this might be like almost a chicken or the egg kind of statement, do you find that you have to first work on the culture of the building before you can work on the academic? Or is it sometimes you need the academic to hook the staff to realize it's the culture that might be affecting it? Like, what do you find in the work that you've been doing in your time? Because, you know, as educators, we all have our own personal beliefs on what affects the other to make it better. But wanted to hear kind of the schools that you've worked with, your belief in your system on that.
I think it's a chicken and egg question for those two things. That the more and more I've engaged with it, I think different people, different educators need more or less of each of those, right? Some people need more of the academics, some people need more of the culture. So there's got to be a multi-pronged work on that. But folks also, most of all, people need to know that there are two parts to this conversation that are intertwined, right? But unfortunately, because people often come from one of those two camps more than the other, they tend to ignore or pretend that it doesn't even exist, right? The hard academic folks are just like, I'm all about the academics, I'm about the academics, blah, 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 blah. Like, they're just like, other stuff doesn't matter, right? For our young people, though, culture matters first. We know that, right? Now, here's the problem. If all we're doing is feeding the academic kind of work, we leave out a whole bunch of kids who like, if you're not going to set the culture right, I don't care what TV show you put on when I come in here, I don't want to watch the show. You know, like we know that. So the culture does matter first, but where I say where the academic matters a little bit first is because we must know that we're trying to do high level, higher order thinking, deeper learning. We need to know that that's what we're building. Because once people think that we're building this shallow learning, this Mickey Mouse regurgitation, right? This write and recite kind of, if they think that that's all we're building, none of this stuff matters. No change matters if all kids need to do is teach to a test, copy lines, copy from the board, fill out the worksheet. If that's where all we need to get to, nothing else matters, right? But once we say, no, our kids should be able to stand up and defend their learning, just like we do in grad school when you hit the not the lecture, but the discussion series in college where you got to talk about what you're learning, not in the big lecture hall. If we think that our young people have to demonstrate that level of intellectualism, then we're like, oh man, I'm not doing that. I'm not teaching in that way. I'm not shifting the cognitive load in that way. I don't have the relationship and the trust from the young people to do that. But when we name where we're trying to get to, then it's like, oh wow, everything does need to shift, right? So it's a little bit of both. And it's organic depending on where you're at. And some places are on fire and you got to put some of the fires out first before we can have any kind of conversation.
I got one final question I have for you, and I don't know if Des has any others,
Okay.
but you started off with the conversation piece about those shallow learners, those ones that want to do this work, but want to do it in best way to put it, the kiddie pool. They want to be able to say they're doing it. They don't really want to get deep into it, but they want to say that they're doing it and kind of coast through it. What do you say to those individuals when they give you, and I know that I feel at least you probably don't allow it to happen, but they give you almost that dog and pony show to get you hooked, to be able to come in and show, like, see, we're bringing in Joe Truss, we're doing this great stuff. But then when you start to work with them, they start putting up red flags. Be like, no, we can't go that deep. What do you do in those situations?
I mean, when I name what I see, right? I mean, you can't necessarily prevent that from happening, right, from the outside. But I name it. I name that disconnect. I name that misalignment, right? And then I invite folks, well, do you want to address this though, right? Do you want to go deeper here, right? You could, right? Ultimately though, like the big thing I think that kind of hopefully motivates folks to do deeper work is, one, we gotta be honest with what the data is telling us. And we have to be honest with how bad we feel about the data of disproportionality or not. Because if we don't feel that bad about it, it doesn't require much shifts. Do you know what I mean? Like if we could tell ourselves some narrative around why this group continues to underperform and blah, 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 no shifts are required, right? Mm-hmm. Because then the dog and pony show doesn't matter, right? Like ultimately folks have to say, I actually want this stuff to shift, right? And we'll see if they want to push through to the next level, right? Because like at some point, someone's going to be mad about the shifts that we're trying to make, but that's where leadership and culture matters. That's why that culture work has to happen first. But if you're not sure with what kind of culture you're building, you're not going to be ready in that moment. You build shallow culture, you can only withstand shallow situations, right? You build deep culture, deep community. Then when shit gets real, when shit gets deep, you can kind of deal with that.
My last question. What is your message to leaders, be that principals, teacher leaders, anyone within the school who identifies as a leader, who knows what needs to be done, right? But is tired, is exhausted, because they're the token that is being spent. And they are just ready to say, I can't do this anymore. What do you say to them?
I mean, one, I think, the reason not to give up is the same reason you decided to start, So, you decided to start this work for a reason, right? Many reasons, often deeply personal, historical, intergenerational, right? So part of this, in a lot of my work, I have people surface and revisit forever their purpose and their why for doing deep work, not just for showing up, right? So part of it, and leaders need this especially because that has to reverberate through an organization, right? Because if the leader is confused or distraught and disillusioned, that's not going to inspire folks. They're not going to pick you up as a leader and all their colleagues. That's not happening. So the leader has to have that deep why. Now, as far as how to avoid some of that exhaustion, you're probably doing too much on your own, right? You're probably trying to do everything solo, right? And either you're taking a top-down approach, or you haven't necessarily built the capacity of other folks to join you in this fight, or you haven't developed people's mindsets or their ability to unpack their own mindsets so they can join you in this work, right? So you're exhausted when you're doing it solo. You're exhausted when you're doing it without a vision. You're exhausted when you're doing it without a team, without a long-term plan. Those are the things that make you exhausted, right? And sometimes we're in deeply toxic places, right? Like that, whether we're there or we're in a district that just is not serving what we need, right? So you definitely got to get some more support on that. That can come from reading, that can come from coaching, but ultimately you got to create this like crew where you are, so that you're not the only person, right? When at some point at my school, when my leadership team started saying we, instead of like, you're talking about doing this, Joe, or this is Joe's stuff, or this is what the school district is doing. When they were like, we're doing this, I was like, oh, I was like, whew. We're now in the we stage. You know what I mean? Like that. But it wasn't like that many times. A lot of times it was like, I don't want to be a part of this team because this is Joe's thing. So figuring out how to shift that to a we, but a we that's focused on racial equity. That's the work. Not easy, right? Mm-hmm. But that's what avoids the exhaustion, right, and the burnout to a certain extent. And stop beating your head against the wall doing the same thing. Same thing that's not going to get you there, right? You need something different.
Joe, thank you so much. We really appreciate you taking this time with us today, getting a chance to talk with our listeners. Is there any final words?
Man, I think in these times, schools they are our safe haven, so we got to treat them that way, both for the young people that are in them, but also for the educators, right? So like, as we're in this place where our nation is pretending like it has amnesia, and we all have amnesia, right? Like, we still are in these schools serving kids, right? And, everybody needs each other, but they're not getting what they need. They're not getting fed and held outside of school as an institution. Maybe they're getting it at home, but outside of that, they're not getting it on TV. They're not getting it from their federal government, however, whether that's local or all the way to the federal. So someplace like the school has to be a safe haven, right? And, I'll say the why piece is, we are liable for what our young people take from these 12, 13, 15 years in our schools, like it's our responsibility for that, right? So regardless of what's going on outside of the schools, there will be young people who grow up at some point and have internalized the messages they get from the school that they went to, not just who was in administration in the federal government, but what they got at school, right? Every day. So just recognizing that as the weight and the responsibility of that, but also the opportunity. But the more you create this insulated place, we can ride this kind of wave out more, right? But when you don't do that, everybody's isolated, everybody's feeling overwhelmed. So at some point, someone's got to like lock arms with their people and figure out what we do together, right? And how we make it through this time and get ready to strike back when that time comes,
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Des, any final words?
Just that this is a movement, right? This is more than just, oh, this is pedagogy. This is a movement. And we have to remember, we can't get that amnesia, as you said, Joe. We have to remember that every movement that has been anything like this has been infiltrated, has been sabotaged, has been co-opted to some degree. And so if we take our eyes off of that ultimate goal, then it's going to be real easy for us to be, hoodwinked, bamboozled, and be led astray to going back to the status quo. And so, Joe, I appreciate the work that you're doing. I appreciate all those who are able to come in with that. I think it's the 100,000 foot view, who can, remind and help those of us who are in it every day to see that, hey, you are marching in a very, very wrong direction because you are so inundated with all the other things, and building that trust and partnering, so that those of us in the school building can use what you're bringing to the table to help us get to where we need to go. And so I appreciate that. I appreciate the work you're doing. Please keep at it. And thank you for being here with us today.
Yeah, no doubt. Appreciate that. Appreciate your work, because it takes everybody everywhere. So, but the more we're connected, the lighter the work is, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Easier it is. So appreciate you all for reaching out. Good luck with the rest of the year, and stay in touch.
Absolutely.
Will do. Thank you again, Joe, for being a part of this and for the words. It's every Friday we try to do these podcasts, and it's professional learning for Des and I when we do this. We always call it that. Like it's uplifting to us, because the fact of it's just great to hear the hard work so many individuals are doing and the successes that come from it, and lets us know, a lot of times lets us know we're not alone. We're not alone in trying to do this work. There are others trying to do it just as well, or doing it better than we're doing it too, and just keep it going. Like you said before, when you said, don't forget your why. I think of those moments with it, and I thank you for that, for being on this and being able to say what you did and what you've been doing and continue doing the great work.
Appreciate it.
Des, as always, love having these conversations with you on a Friday. With that, school's out.
You all will be missed. Until then, I gotta blow you a kiss. Until we meet again on that other side, this my rhyme. We all love you to the end of this time, always. Know this, you all will be missed. Until then, I gotta blow you a kiss. Until we meet again on that other side, this my rhyme. We all love you to the end of this time, always.